Jack had always lived a quiet life after retiring from the fire department. His small cabin nestled deep in the woods was his sanctuary, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts and the memories of a past he couldn't quite let go of. But on one bitterly cold winter night everything changed as he opened his door to the sight of a trembling German shepherd, her ribs visible beneath her matted fur, her eyes filled with exhaustion, and behind her 2 tiny puppies barely clinging to warmth. Jack hesitated for a moment, knowing the risks of taking in strays, but something in the mother's desperate gaze pulled at something deep within him. He stepped aside, letting them in, watching as she cautiously led her pups onto the warmth of his wooden floor. He moved quickly, wrapping them in blankets, placing a bowl of warm water near them, watching as the mother lapped it up as though she hadn't had a drink in days. The puppies whimpered, curling into their mother's side, and Jack found himself kneeling beside them, whispering softly, unsure if he was comforting them or himself. He named her Grace, because despite everything she carried herself with a quiet strength that reminded him of something he had long forgotten. The days passed, and Grace began to trust him, allowing him to tend to her wounds and feed her properly. The puppies grew stronger, their small tails wagging whenever Jack entered the room. For the first time in years, he felt something close to purpose, but there was something in the way Grace would stare out the window at night, her ears perked as if waiting for something. One evening, as the fire crackled and the wind howled outside, Jack noticed a shadow moving through the trees. His heart pounded as he stepped onto the porch, peering into the darkness, and then he saw it, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching unmoving. He felt Grace tense beside him, a low growl rising in her throat. She knew who it was before he did, and then the man stepped forward, his voice cutting through the cold like a blade. "That's my dog." Jack's blood ran cold. He looked down at Grace, who pressed against his leg, her body rigid with fear, and for the first time he understood she hadn't been lost. She had been running, escaping something or someone, and now that someone had come back for her. The man took another step forward, his expression dark and full of something Jack didn't like. "You don't understand," he said. "She's mine, she belongs to me." But Jack saw the way Grace's tail tucked, the way her body lowered, and he knew the truth. "No, she doesn't," he said firmly, his voice steady even as anger boiled beneath the surface. The man's jaw clenched. He glanced at the cabin, then at Jack, then at Grace, as if weighing his chances. But before he could speak, Grace did. She stepped in front of Jack, her growl deep and threatening, her stance unwavering. She had been afraid before, but not now. Now she was protecting the one person who had protected her. Jack could feel the warmth of her body against his leg, and he knew without a doubt she had chosen him over the past she had left behind. The man took a step back, then another, the realization sinking in that he had lost whatever control he once had over her. Jack didn't move until the figure disappeared into the darkness. Grace stayed beside him until the night was quiet once more. Then, and only then, did she lean against him, her head pressing into his hand, as if to say thank you. Jack let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding, running his fingers through her fur. "You're home now, Grace," he whispered, and for the first time since he had found her, she wagged her tail, curling up beside him as the fire burned warm and steady in the hearth. The days that followed were filled with a new sense of peace. Grace no longer paced by the windows at night, no longer flinched at sudden noises or looked over her shoulder as if expecting something to come for her. She had let go of her past because she knew she was safe now. The puppies grew stronger, their once frail bodies filling out, their eyes bright and full of curiosity. They followed Jack everywhere, stumbling over their own paws as they explored the cabin, their playful yips filling the once quiet space with life. Jack found himself laughing more than he had in years, a deep, genuine laughter that echoed through the walls. One morning, as he sipped his coffee watching the snowfall outside, he felt Grace rest her head on his knee. He glanced down, meeting her steady gaze. There was something different in her eyes, not fear, not weariness, but something deeper, something that spoke of trust. She had given him her loyalty, not because he had demanded it, but because he had earned it. Winter slowly melted into spring, the snow retreating to reveal the earth beneath. Jack spent his days repairing the fence, clearing fallen branches, and teaching the puppies how to chase sticks. Grace was never far from his side, always watching, always aware of everything around her, but not out of fear, out of instinct. She had once been forced to survive, but now she was simply living. One evening, as the sun dipped low painting the sky in streaks of orange and gold, Jack sat on the porch, the puppies curled up beside him, Grace sitting tall, her ears twitching as she listened to the world around her. He ran a hand over her back, feeling the warmth of her fur. "You did good, girl," he murmured. She turned her head, pressing her nose into his palm, closing her eyes for a moment, as if savoring the touch. He knew then that he hadn't just saved her, she had saved him too. The past no longer held either of them captive. They had found something rare, something unspoken, but understood: a home, a family, a second chance at the kind of life they both deserved. As the stars began to appear above them, Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the world finally lifted from his shoulders. Grace lay down beside him, the puppies nestled close, and for the first time in a long time Jack knew without a doubt that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the seasons changed, so did the rhythm of their lives. The once fragile puppies had grown into strong, playful dogs, their boundless energy filling the cabin with laughter and life. Grace remained ever watchful, a steady presence, a guardian not just of Jack, but of the home they had built together. She no longer flinched at the past, she no longer looked over her shoulder. She had left behind the life of fear and uncertainty, replacing it with something unbreakable: love, trust, and the quiet understanding that she was safe, that she belonged. Jack had always been a man of few words, but he didn't need to say anything to know that Grace understood him. Some bonds went beyond language, in the way she rested her head against his knee, in the way she ran beside him when they walked the trails in the woods, in the way she placed herself between him and anything unfamiliar, not out of fear, but out of loyalty. One crisp autumn morning, as Jack stacked firewood for the coming winter, he noticed Grace standing at the edge of the clearing, her ears perked, eyes focused on something in the distance. Jack followed her gaze, expecting to see a deer or a stray traveler, but his breath caught in his throat. Standing just beyond the tree line was the man from that night, the one who had tried to take her back. The air between them felt heavier than the sky before a storm. Jack felt Grace press against his leg, her body rigid, but her tail did not tuck, her ears did not flatten. She was not afraid, not anymore. The man stepped forward, his hands raised, as if to show he meant no harm. His voice was quieter this time, more hesitant. "I just wanted to see if she was okay." Jack's fists clenched, but he forced himself to take a slow breath. He glanced down at Grace, who remained still, unwavering. He knelt beside her, running a hand through her fur. Her eyes met his, steady, strong, waiting for his choice. Jack turned back to the man, his voice calm but firm. "She's not yours anymore, she's home." The man looked at Grace, his face unreadable, before he nodded once, turning without another word, disappearing into the trees. Grace watched him go, her posture never shifting. When he was gone, she let out a breath and nudged Jack's hand, as if to reassure him it was over for good this time. Jack let out a slow breath, standing up and looking down at her. "You're really staying, huh, girl?" Grace wagged her tail, pressing her nose against his palm, and in that moment Jack knew that no matter what happened next, no matter how many seasons passed, Grace would always be by his side. She had made her choice, and he had made his. As the sun rose higher, spilling golden light over the trees, Jack picked up another log for the fire. Grace followed at his heel, her head held high, her past finally behind her, and her future right where she had always belonged, beside the man who had saved her, beside the man she had saved too. As the last trace of the man disappeared into the trees, Jack let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding Grace, stood beside him, her body relaxed, but her presence unwavering. He reached down, running a rough hand through her fur, and she leaned into his touch in silent understanding. Whatever ghosts had haunted her before were gone now, buried beneath the leaves of the past, where they would stay forever. Jack knew what it was like to carry old wounds, to live with memories that lingered longer than they should. But as he stood there with Grace by his side, he realized something: neither of them were running anymore. They had stopped searching for safety, because they had already found it. The rest of the day passed quietly. The puppies, now young and full of life, chased each other through the fallen leaves, kicking up gold and amber as they tumbled and played. Jack stacked the last of the firewood for the coming winter, pausing every now and then to watch the way the sunlight filtered through the trees, turning everything warm and golden. Grace stayed close, occasionally looking up at him as if to check that he was still there. Jack smiled, shaking his head. "You're stuck with me now, girl," he said, his voice softer than usual. Grace wagged her tail, settling at his feet, as if to say, "I wouldn't have it any other way." As night fell, the cabin glowed warmly against the dark sky. The fire crackled in the hearth, filling the air with the comforting scent of burning wood. Jack sat in his usual chair, the puppies curled up near the fire, their bellies full, and their breathing slow and steady. Grace lay beside him, her head resting on her paws, but her eyes remained open, watching Jack with a quiet devotion that needed no words. He reached down, absently scratching behind her ear. She let out a soft sigh, her tail thumping once against the wooden floor, the sound of contentment, of trust, of home. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the scent of pine and the crisp promise of winter. Jack looked out the window, watching as the stars blinked into existence one by one. For years he had lived alone, carrying burdens that felt too heavy to share, but now, as he sat in the warm glow of the fire with Grace at his side, and the sound of the puppy's soft breathing filling the cabin, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Tomorrow there would be more firewood to chop, more trails to clear, more days spent watching the dogs grow strong and fearless under Grace's watchful eye. But tonight there was only this: the warmth of the fire, the quiet presence of those he had come to love, and the unshakable knowledge that he was exactly where he was meant to be. As the fire crackled and the warmth of the cabin wrapped around them like a familiar embrace, Jack leaned back in his chair, his rough hands resting on the arms of the worn wood, his gaze drifting between the sleeping puppies, the gentle rise and fall of their tiny chests, and Grace, her steady presence and anchor in the quiet night. She was still awake, her deep brown eyes watching him with something close to understanding, as if she knew that for the first time in years he felt truly at home. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, the first signs of winter creeping in, but inside there was only peace, the kind that Jack had thought was lost to him long ago. He had spent years believing that solitude was the only way he could live, that the ghosts of his past would always be too heavy to carry with anyone else. But now, as he looked at the small family that had formed around him, he realized how wrong he had been. Grace had saved him in ways he hadn't expected, pulling him out of the quiet emptiness he had once mistaken for peace. The fire burned lower, casting flickering shadows across the walls. Jack's eyelids grew heavy, but before he let sleep take him, he felt a nudge against his knee. He opened his eyes to see Grace standing beside him, looking up at him with quiet patience, as if waiting for something. Without thinking, he reached out his hand, running it through her thick fur. She leaned into him, closing her eyes, as his fingers traced the scars that had long since healed, but still told a story. She had been through hell and back just like him, and yet here they were together. Jack smiled softly, shaking his head. "You really were meant to find me, weren't you, girl?" Grace let out a soft huff, as if agreeing, before lowering herself onto the floor, her body curled near his feet, her breathing slow and steady. Jack let his head rest against the back of the chair, his gaze drifting to the window, where the stars stretched endlessly across the cold night sky. He had spent so many years believing that some things once lost could never be found again, but here in the quiet glow of the fire, surrounded by the ones who had become his family, he knew now that wasn't true. Some things had a way of finding you when you needed them the most. And as the last embers of the fire flickered, Jack closed his eyes, his hands still resting on Grace's back, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he let himself sleep without fear, without regret, without the weight of yesterday pressing down on him. Tomorrow would come with a rising sun, with new challenges, new days. But for now, for this moment, he was home, he was safe, and that was enough. As the first light of dawn crept through the frost-covered window, Jack stirred in his chair, the warmth of the fire now only a faint ember in the hearth. He blinked, slowly adjusting to the soft golden glow that filled the cabin. Outside, the world was still wrapped in the hush of early morning. Snow dusted the ground, turning the forest into a quiet white expanse, untouched and new. But inside the cabin, life was already stirring. Grace lifted her head first, her ears twitching at the faint rustle of movement outside. She stretched, rising to her feet and shaking off the last traces of sleep before padding silently toward the door. Jack watched her, his mind still caught between the fading remnants of dreams and the comforting weight of reality. She paused, glancing back at him, waiting for his signal. He pushed himself up from the chair, his muscles stiff from the night, but there was a certain ease in his movements now, a lightness that hadn't been there before. He grabbed his coat from the hook by the door, pulling it over his shoulders before unlatching the door, and stepping out into the crisp morning air, the cold was sharp but invigorating, waking him fully. As his breath formed small clouds in front of him, Grace stepped out beside him, her paws sinking into the soft snow, but she didn't flinch. She was built for this, for the wilderness, for survival. And yet now, she had something more than just instinct. She had a home, a family. Behind them, the two young dogs bounded out onto the porch, their excitement turning the quiet morning into a flurry of energy. Their tails wagged furiously as they chased each other through the snow, nipping and tumbling. Jack shook his head with a chuckle, letting the sound of their play fill the air. It was a sound he had come to love, the once empty silence of his life now replaced by the joyful chaos of companionship. As he made his way toward the woodpile, Grace followed at his side, her presence steady and familiar. It was strange how something so unexpected had come into his life, and yet now he couldn't imagine a world without her. She had become more than just a dog, more than just a companion. She was part of him, as much as the land, as much as the home he had built. She had carved out a space in his life that he hadn't even realized was empty until she filled it. He bent down, picking up a log and tossing it onto the growing stack, preparing for another long winter. As he worked, Grace remained nearby, keeping watch just as she always did, her eyes scanning the treeline, her body relaxed but alert. Jack knew she no longer waited for something to come out of those woods, no longer feared the past creeping back into her life. She had let go just as he had. She was no longer running from something. She was standing in something solid, something real, something that had finally given her the peace she deserved. Jack exhaled slowly, standing upright and looking out over the land. His land. The morning sun stretched over the horizon, casting long golden rays through the trees. Everything felt different now, lighter, not just in the way the world looked, but in the way it felt, in the way the weight on his shoulders had lifted, in the way his heart no longer carried the same heaviness it once had. For so long he had believed that peace was something he would never find again, that love and loyalty were things of the past. But now, as Grace sat beside him watching over their home, and the young dogs played without a care in the world, he knew he had been wrong. Without thinking, he reached down, resting a hand on Grace's head. Her ears flicked slightly at his touch, but she didn't move, didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into it, a quiet, unspoken understanding passing between them. They didn't need words, they never had. Some things were felt deeper than language could ever express. She was home, he was home, and that was all that mattered. As the sun continued its slow ascent, Jack let out a breath, turning back toward the cabin, toward the life they had built together. The past was gone, the future was theirs, and whatever came next, they would face it together. As the morning stretched on, Jack moved through his daily routine, splitting firewood, stacking it neatly by the cabin door, checking the traps he had set along the creek. Everything about his life had a rhythm, a purpose, and for the first time in years it wasn't just about survival. It was about living. Grace followed him, as always, her presence steady, her watchful eyes scanning the trees. But there was no fear in her movements anymore, no hesitation. She had left her old life behind fully and completely. Now she stood beside Jack, not as something broken, but as something whole. The young dogs raced through the snow, their boundless energy a contrast to Grace's quiet confidence. Jack watched them, shaking his head with a small smile. They were growing strong under her guidance, learning the ways of the land, learning when to play and when to listen. He hadn't intended to keep them at first. He thought maybe they would find homes elsewhere, but now he couldn't imagine parting with them. They belonged here just as much as he and Grace did. As he carried the last bundle of wood toward the porch, he felt Grace brush against his leg, a small nudge of reassurance, a reminder that she was still there. He glanced down, meeting her deep brown eyes. "What is it, girl?" he asked softly. She didn't respond, not in the way people expected, but in her own way, in the way her ears twitched, in the way her gaze held steady, in the way her body stayed close. It was enough. The afternoon passed in a quiet sort of peace, the kind Jack had learned to appreciate. He sat on the porch, sharpening his old hunting knife, as Grace lay beside him, her ears twitching occasionally at the distant sounds of the forest. The young dogs wrestled in the snow, their playful growls filling the air. Jack watched them with a quiet contentment, letting the simple joy of the moment settle into his bones. Then, as the sun began to dip behind the trees, turning the sky into streaks of gold and crimson, Jack felt Grace shift beside him, her body tensing just slightly. He followed her gaze toward the tree-line. Something moved there, a shape emerging from the shadows. His muscles coiled for a moment, old instincts kicking in. But as the figure stepped into the fading light, he realized it was no threat. A woman wrapped in a heavy coat, a backpack slung over one shoulder, moving carefully through the snow, her steps unsure, as if she wasn't used to walking on uneven terrain. Jack narrowed his eyes, watching as she hesitated at the edge of his property, her breath forming small clouds in the cold. She wasn't lost, not exactly, but she also wasn't sure if she was welcome. Grace didn't growl, didn't bristle, just watched her with the same steady gaze she always had. Jack took that as a sign of trust. Standing slowly and stepping off the porch, he didn't say anything at first, letting the quiet settle between them before he finally spoke. "You looking for something?" The woman exhaled, her shoulders sagging slightly, as if she had been holding in tension for too long. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something tired, something searching. "I was told there was someone out here, someone who might understand." Jack frowned, glancing at Grace, who remained at his side, then back at the woman. "What do you mean?" She shifted her weight, glancing toward the cabin, then at Grace, then finally meeting Jack's gaze. "I think you knew my father," she said, her voice quieter now. Her name was Grace. The words hit him harder than he expected, knocking the breath from his lungs. For a moment Jack stared at her, trying to piece together what she was saying. Then he looked down at Grace, who sat calmly beside him, as if she understood something he didn't. His voice was rough when he finally spoke. "You better come inside." As the woman stepped cautiously toward the cabin, Jack studied her face, trying to piece together the connection. She claimed to have her cheeks were flushed from the cold, her dark eyes wary yet searching. Grace remained at his side, her body relaxed but attentive, watching the woman with quiet curiosity, as if sensing something Jack couldn't yet understand. He pushed open the cabin door, stepping aside to let her in. The warmth of the fire wrapped around them as she hesitated at the threshold before finally stepping inside. Removing her coat and backpack, she glanced around, taking in the small but sturdy home, the worn wooden furniture, the smell of burning pine, the quiet presence of the two younger dogs curled near the hearth, as if they had never known a world beyond this place. Jack poured 2 cups of coffee, setting one on the table before lowering himself into the chair across from her, his rough hands curled around his own mug. The silence stretched between them, but he didn't rush her. She had come here for a reason, and whatever that reason was, she would get to it in her own time. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, breathing in the steam before finally speaking. "I didn't know him, not really," she said, her voice steady but carrying the weight of something deeper. "I grew up knowing his name, but not the man he left before I was born. My mother never spoke much about him except to say that he was troubled, that he disappeared into the world like a ghost, and that I shouldn't waste my life chasing someone who didn't want to be found." Jack listened without interrupting, his gaze steady. She exhaled, shifting slightly in her seat. "But after my mother passed, I found something, letters hidden in a box in the attic. They were never sent, all addressed to me, written by a man who thought about me more than I was ever led to believe." Jack remained silent, but his grip on the mug tightened just slightly. "One of the letters mentioned you," she continued. "He wrote about a man who lived deep in the woods, someone he trusted, someone he envied in a way because you had found peace when he never could. He mentioned that if I ever wanted answers, I should start here, that maybe you could tell me who he really was." Jack let out a slow breath, setting his coffee down, his mind pulling back through the years he had known a man like that once, someone who carried too many ghosts, someone who had been lost long before he ever disappeared. His voice was quiet when he finally spoke his name. The woman nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug like she was holding on to something fragile. "That's him," she whispered. Jack leaned back in his chair, glancing at Grace, who sat at his feet, her presence grounding him, before he looked back at the woman. "There's a lot I could tell you," he admitted, "some of it good, some of it not so good, but if you came all this way, I figure you deserve to hear it." Her lips pressed together in something like relief, like she had been waiting for permission to ask the thing she had held inside for too long. Jack glanced once more at Grace, then back at the woman before nodding. "All right," then he said, "let's talk." The woman took a deep breath, her fingers still tracing the edge of the mug, as if preparing herself to hear something that might shatter the quiet of the moment. She looked at Jack, her eyes searching for something more than just the man who had lived alone in the woods for years, as though she were trying to piece together a puzzle that had been hidden from her for far too long. Jack met her gaze, his expression steady but unreadable, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The crackling of the fire was the only sound that filled the room, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Finally, she broke the silence, her voice steady but full of the weight of years of questions. "What was he like? Was he a good man?" Jack paused, the weight of her words settling over him. He had known the man she spoke of, had seen the darkness in his eyes, the haunted look that never quite left him. There were moments when he was kind, when the burden of his past seemed to lift for a fleeting second, but they were rare, like the calm before a storm. "He tried," Jack said slowly, his voice low, "but he was a man who couldn't outrun his past. There were things he did, things he couldn't forgive himself for, no matter how much he wanted to. He loved you, though, in his own way. He just didn't know how to show it." The woman's eyes glistened, and for a moment, Jack could see the pieces of her past falling into place, the confusion and pain of growing up with half-truths and unanswered questions finally finding some clarity. She nodded, wiping a stray tear from her cheek, before looking up at him, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did he ever talk about me?" Jack shifted in his seat, his thoughts momentarily drifting back to the letters, the cryptic words the man had written, the way he had spoken of her as though she were a dream he couldn't quite reach. "He did," Jack said quietly. "He spoke of you often, even when he didn't mean to. There was always a longing in his voice when he mentioned your name, like he wished he could have been the father he thought you deserved. But he was lost, and he couldn't find his way back." She let out a breath, her hand tightening around the mug as she processed his words. Grace shifted to Jack's feet, her gentle eyes watching the woman, sensing the weight of the moment. Jack sat back, his own thoughts swirling in the quiet space between them, and waited. There was more to say, but for now, it was enough to let her absorb the pieces of the story that had been left untold for so long. And in the stillness of the cabin, the fire crackling softly in the background, the woman seemed to find some semblance of peace in the knowledge that she was no longer chasing the ghost of a man she had never truly known. The woman sat there for a long moment, her eyes distant as if she were trying to absorb everything Jack had just said, piecing together the fragments of her past into something she could finally understand. The room felt heavier now, filled with the weight of history and unspoken words, but there was a softness in her gaze as she slowly lifted her head to meet Jack's eyes again. "He never got the chance to be the man he could have been, did he?" she asked, her voice soft, almost to herself. Jack's heart tightened at the question, the ache of old regrets stirring within him. He knew that question wasn't just about the man they spoke of. It was about the choices they all made, the paths they walked, and the things they left behind. He nodded slowly, his voice low. "No, he didn't." There was a long pause, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if the air in the cabin had shifted, as though they had stepped into a moment of shared understanding, the silence no longer something to fill but something to hold. Grace moved quietly beside him, her head resting on his leg, and Jack ran his fingers through her fur absently as the woman continued to stare into the fire, her thoughts clearly far away. Finally, she spoke again, her voice carrying a newfound strength. "I thought I was coming here to find answers, to know who he really was, what happened to him." She looked up at Jack, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "But I think I already knew in some way. You told me what he couldn't say. Maybe that's enough for me." Jack watched her carefully, taking in the way her shoulders had relaxed, the sadness in her eyes now mingled with a quiet acceptance. He couldn't help but feel a flicker of something. Maybe it was hope, or maybe just the understanding that sometimes people weren't meant to be saved, only understood. "It's not an easy thing to face," he said softly. "Sometimes it's easier to carry the weight of questions than to know the truth." She exhaled slowly, her gaze lingering on the fire before turning back to him. "It is easier. But now I think I can finally let go." Jack didn't respond right away, his mind still wrestling with the fact that this woman, who had come to him with so much uncertainty, was now standing on the edge of something that felt like closure. For the first time since he had met her, Jack allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there could be a kind of peace in letting go of the ghosts that haunted them all. "I should go," she said eventually, standing up, her voice steady but carrying a new resolve. Jack didn't move at first, just watching her, and Grace lifted her head, eyes following the woman as she made her way toward the door. He wasn't sure why, but something told him that this was more than just an ending. It felt like a beginning of sorts. A new chapter, even if it was one they weren't quite ready to write yet. "Wait," Jack said, stopping her just as her hand touched the doorframe. She turned back to him, eyebrow raised in question. He stood up slowly, taking a breath, unsure of why the words were coming to him now, but needing to say them. "I want you to know he wasn't all bad. Not by a long shot. He had his demons, sure, but he had moments of good, too. And he tried, even if it didn't always look like it." The woman's eyes softened, and she gave him a small nod, as if acknowledging the truth in his words, before she smiled, just barely, but enough to make Jack think that maybe she was starting to understand something deeper than the pain she had carried for so long. "I know," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "I think I always knew." And with that, she turned and stepped out into the cold night, the door clicking shut behind her. Jack stood there for a long time after, the quiet of the cabin settling around him once more. Grace padded over to his side, resting her head on his knee as he stared into the fire. The world outside was still, the snow falling softly against the windows. But inside, it felt like something had shifted, something that didn't need words to be understood. And in that quiet, Jack let himself believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a way forward for everyone, even the ghosts that lingered, just out of reach. The night grew deeper, the fire in the hearth crackling softly as Jack sat there, his thoughts lingering on the woman's departure. The cabin felt emptier somehow, even though Grace remained at his side, her warm presence a reminder of the loyalty and comfort that had anchored him through years of solitude. The storm outside had picked up, the wind howling against the walls, but inside, the silence felt different. It wasn't oppressive or heavy, it was contemplative, almost like the world was giving them space to breathe, to sit with everything that had just unfolded. Jack leaned back in his chair, his fingers still absently brushing through Grace's fur, as his mind turned over the woman's words. He had known from the moment she stepped through the door that she was looking for something. Answers, yes, but something deeper, something she hadn't been able to find anywhere else. And now, as the hours stretched on, Jack couldn't help but wonder if the answers she'd found here were enough. The thought of the man she'd come to seek, the one who had once been lost in these woods with Jack, lingered in his mind. A man who had never been able to outrun his past, whose regrets had woven themselves into the very fabric of his being. Jack wondered if he had done enough for him, if there had been something more he could have said or done to pull him back from the edge. But then he remembered the look on the woman's face when she left. There was a lightness there, a quiet peace that hadn't been there when she first arrived. Maybe, just maybe, that was enough. Grace stirred, lifting her head from Jack's lap and glancing toward the window, her ears perked. Jack followed her gaze, his senses sharpening as he noticed the faint crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. The cabin door creaked open, the cold air rushing in with a gust of wind. Jack's hand instinctively moved toward the knife at his belt, but the person who stepped inside was not a threat. It was her. The woman stood in the doorway, her coat soaked from the storm, her face flushed with the cold. She looked uncertain for a moment, as though she had hesitated before returning, but then her eyes met Jack's, and there was a quiet resolve in her gaze. "I forgot something," she said, her voice steady despite the way the cold had settled into her bones. Jack didn't ask what it was, though he knew she hadn't come back for anything material. There was something else, something she hadn't yet been able to shake, and Jack sensed that this was the part of the journey she hadn't yet finished. He stood slowly, a silent invitation in his posture, and gestured to the chair across from him. "Come on in. You're welcome to stay a while." She nodded, stepping into the warmth of the cabin once more, the door closing behind her with a soft thud. Grace rose to her feet, her tail wagging as she approached the woman, nudging her gently with her nose, a silent offering of comfort. The woman smiled, crouching down to pet the dog, and Jack watched as the quiet exchange between them unfolded. There was something so simple, so pure, in the way Grace had greeted her, as though offering the kind of warmth that words couldn't quite capture. The woman straightened up after a moment, meeting Jack's gaze again. "I thought I could leave, you know," she said quietly. "I thought I had the answers I needed, that I could just walk away. But there's more. There's still more I need to understand." Jack nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to be able to walk away so easily. Sometimes, even when you think you've found closure, there's always something left unfinished, a question left unasked, a truth left unsaid. "I don't have all the answers," Jack said, his voice low, "but I can share what I know. I can tell you about the man he was, the parts of him that maybe weren't so easy to see. And maybe that's where you'll find what you're looking for." She took a deep breath, her shoulders relaxing just a little as she looked around the cabin again, as if trying to find the words that had been so hard to say before. I think I came back because I need to know that he was more than the ghosts he left behind. That maybe, even in the darkness, there was something good in him." Her voice faltered for a moment, but then she squared her shoulders and looked at Jack with determination. "I need to understand who he was and why he couldn't stay." Jack studied her for a long moment, his eyes softening with understanding. "He was a man who couldn't escape his demons, but that doesn't mean he didn't try. Sometimes, even the best of us get lost along the way. He wanted to be more than what he became, but he never knew how to break free. I'll tell you what I can, but know this, what he couldn't say, he carried with him. And that's something I can't give you, no matter how hard I try." The woman nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with the weight of all that had been said. "That's all I needed to hear," she whispered. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The fire crackled in the hearth, and the wind howled outside, but inside, there was a stillness, a calm that settled over them both. Jack felt the weight of the years lift just a little, the unspoken truths finally finding a place in the world. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of the cabin and the presence of the woman who had come seeking answers, Jack realized that sometimes the act of telling a story, of sharing the truth, no matter how painful, is what makes it possible to finally move forward. The fire crackled softly as Jack sat back down in his chair, his gaze fixed on the glowing embers. Grace, sensing the quiet peace that had settled over the room, curled up by his feet, her breathing steady and calm. Jack allowed himself to sit in the stillness, his mind wandering back to the past, to the man he had once known and the woman who had come seeking answers. The night outside seemed to grow deeper, the snow continuing its slow descent in the dark. Jack didn't need to look out the window to know the world was frozen in time, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. But inside, in the warmth of the cabin, there was a sense of quiet resolution. The questions had been asked, the answers given, and though some pieces of the puzzle would remain forever incomplete, Jack felt something in him shift, something lighter, something that hadn't been there before. He stood after a while, stretching the stiffness from his limbs, and moved toward the door. It was already late, but he found himself wanting to step outside, to feel the crisp air against his skin, to let the night wash over him. He opened the door quietly, letting the cold breeze rush in before stepping out onto the porch, his boots crunching in the snow. The silence of the woods wrapped around him like an old friend, familiar and unyielding. For the first time in a long time, it didn't feel as heavy as it once had. Maybe it was the woman's words, or the quiet peace in her departure, or perhaps it was simply time. Whatever it was, Jack felt a small sense of something akin to relief, as if the weight he had carried for years had lessened, even if just a little. The night was clear, the stars sharp against the black canvas of the sky, and Jack allowed himself a long breath, savoring the cold air. He looked toward the path that wound its way through the trees, the same path the woman had taken moments ago, and wondered where it might lead her. But as quickly as the thought came, he pushed it away. She had her own journey now, one that no longer required him to guide her. Jack turned back toward the cabin, the warmth calling to him, and closed the door behind him. Inside, Grace was already asleep, her tail twitching slightly in her dreams. Jack stood there for a moment, watching the flicker of the fire, the quiet of the room wrapping around him like a blanket. In the end, some stories were never fully told, and some questions were never fully answered. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some things were meant to be left untold, for time to carry them away. As Jack sat down again, a quiet peace settled over him, knowing that he had done what he could. And in the flickering light of the fire, with Grace at his side, Jack allowed himself to finally rest. The ghosts of the past were fading into the shadows, and in their place was something new, something he hadn't known he needed until now. The story had ended, but in its place, a new beginning was quietly unfolding. And for the first time in years, Jack felt ready to face whatever came next.